Thanks, and thanks everyone for being part of this process, which I think is a really good process. So I'm just going to talk quickly, not more than 15 minutes, about what is a carbon footprint? Where do our carbon impacts come from? And just in very general terms about some of the ways in which where those carbon footprints come from, and some of the ways in which we can bring them downwards. So you hear this term carbon footprint a lot. I just want to describe it's kind of a shorthand for the total climate change impact of anything, an activity or an object. So if you say, well, what's the carbon footprint of my phone? That would be, what is the climate change impact of all the processes that had to go on in the manufacture of this phone, including digging the minerals out of the ground, turning them into metals, turning them into complex parts, putting them all together, putting them in a nice shiny box and getting them to me. And then there's also the carbon footprint of using the phone, which comes out of what's the carbon footprint of the generating the electricity that is needed in its use. And if you look at, if you ask what's the carbon footprint of driving, for example, it would be, some of that would be the carbon footprint of the emissions that come out of the exhaust pipe of the car, if it's not an electric one. But that's not the whole story. You've also got some other emissions that go on. So there are more emissions involved in getting the oil out of the ground, taking that oil to a refinery, refining it, turning it into petrol or diesel, and then driving that diesel to a petrol station. So there's a whole load of bits of emissions like that clock up along the way. And then you drive the car, and the full carbon footprint of driving also includes the fact that every 200,000 miles or so, you probably have to get a new car needs to be manufactured, and that's got a whole big carbon footprint because you've got to get all the minerals out of the ground, turn it into a new car, and so on. And there's other bits and pieces as well. So during the lifetime of the car, you need to do maintenance, and that also involves some emissions, some directly at the garage, that the garage using electricity to drive the drills and parts and everything that do the maintenance, but also the carbon footprint of all the parts that have to be manufactured and bought in and so on. So if you look at the carbon footprint of just about anything, it's practically impossible to be accurate about it because it's so complex. If you look at, let's say, what's the carbon footprint of this phone that I'm using? And in my work, I look at this kind of thing a lot. If you look at all the processes that had to go on to create that phone, actually they go on forever, and in ever smaller little bits. If you can follow all these pathways, and so you have to find ways of making best estimates that are. The good news is you can usually make good enough estimates that are good enough for us to be able to get a sense of the kinds of things that matter the most in terms of bringing our carbon down, and the kinds of things that we can chill out about a bit more. But if anyone ever talks to you about being really accurate, it's not really quite right. The nature of the beast is that it's just it's always harder to measure than that. When you're looking at a carbon footprint, by which we mean when we're talking about the total carbon impact of an object, a thing or an activity. And the other thing to say is that we say carbon, but actually it's really a shorthand. What we mean is a greenhouse gas footprint, because you probably heard that there are more than one. Carbon dioxide is the biggest contributor to climate change, but there are other greenhouse gases as well. The second most important one is methane, and there are other gases as well that contribute, and there are some other processes that also contribute as well. And we sort of add them all up together into a kind of carbon dioxide equivalent. And that's the unit that we use. Okay, so next slide. Great. So just I said it was rough numbers. Here's an estimate of what the average UK person's carbon footprint looks like. So this is if you look at everything that they do and buy in the whole of their lifestyles, and it divides up pretty nicely as a best estimate into roughly 4 almost equal quarters. So about a quarter of it is food, about a quarter of it is everything to do with their home and their accommodation, and that includes kind of energy that they use in their home. It includes the fact they might have to maintain their home every now and again. It includes the fact that every now and again people buy a new home, brand new home. And it also includes kind of the carbon footprint of if you ever go off and stay in a hotel or, you know, away from home or something like that. And then slightly bigger than quarter is about travel. And then slightly smaller than a quarter is, I'm just calling it everything else. And that's everything, that's all the non-edible things that you buy. So things like my phone and this book and the clothes I'm wearing and the furnishings in your home, you know, everything physical that you buy that you don't eat. But it also is a kind of a catch-all for a whole load of services that you might buy, but also your contribution to all the government, all the kind of national services that go on, like the fact that you contribute to a health service and you contribute to there's an education system that you're part of, and there's also a defence. The UK has an army and a police force and all that kind of, and it has a government system and all the rest of it. And there's a kind of a proportionate allocation of your contribution to all of that. So there we go. That's it in 4 rough quarters. And of course, so that would be your carbon footprint. It's somewhere around the 10 tons mark if you're an absolutely average person. But of course, the shape of every individual's footprint is really different. And 2 things quickly to say about this, and we'll hear a bit more about it in a minute, is that by and large, it's not always the case, but by and large, wealthier people have bigger carbon footprints because they buy and do more stuff, so they have a bigger climate change impact, and less well-off people tend to have smaller climate change impacts. But also, it really depends on what the shape of your lifestyle is. So, you know, some people don't have cars and never fly, and their travel footprint is likely to be a lot smaller. We'll look at that in a sec. So next slide, actually. All right, so if you were to break it down into a bit more detail, so first up, the food. Almost all of the food is about food and drink that we buy from shops, but there's a little bit down here which is eating out. Obviously, some people eat out more than others. Home and accommodation. So there's a little bit here which is when you're people staying away from home, with a hotel or a B&B or whatever it is you're staying in. 6% of the total thing here is the actual carbon footprint of housing. So that's maintaining and building new houses. Then this chunk here is household fuel. That's not including electricity, but that would be oil, gas, coal if you use gas. So that's 11% of the total. And then this chunk here is household electricity. The good news about this is that this is falling year on year, or has been falling quite fast because the UK has been decarbonising its grid, getting more and more of its electricity from renewable sources, less and less of it from fossil fuel. Moving on to the travel bit, just see how my time's going, okay. Travel bit, so it really varies depending on who you are. So there's a little bit up here for trains, buses and other public transport, this bit here. This is the bit that it would be really good to make this one bigger, because if you could make this one bigger, you could in doing so almost certainly cut out some of these other bits here, because it's the most carbon friendly. It tends to be one of the most carbon friendly ways of travelling per mile. Ferry crossings and cruises, just a little bit there. This is personal flights here. So it's a massive 9%. Sometimes you hear people talk about flying being sort of 2 or 3% of the world's carbon footprint. But if you're in the UK, it's higher than that because we're a rich country and we're an island and we tend to fly more. And also for sort of complicated reasons, flying is quite often gets underestimated its impact. So flying is 9%, but of course most people in the UK actually never fly. Which means that if you're someone who flies a lot, then it could be absolutely dominating your carbon footprint. And then you've got 3% here, which is cars. That's the manufacture of cars and maintaining of cars, not driving them. And then this chunk here, this 11%, is vehicle fuel. So that's the travel bit. Then everything else, this chunk here is the non-food shopping. As I said, everything from iPhones to your clothing and your furnishings and so on. Then leisure, recreation and activities, other bought services. Any service you buy has a carbon footprint. Even if it's just your household insurance. I mean, that's done by people in offices who who keep warm in their offices and sometimes get on airplanes and so on. So that's why that has a carbon footprint. Water, waste and sewage. And then there's a 10% here, which is kind of everything else, health, education, and all the other public services. And that's your sort of proportionate contribution to that. So there we are. And so what would you do, just in the last couple of minutes that I've got, how would you bring any of that downwards? Well, the most important thing on food and drink is that the carbon footprint of food and drink comes mainly from the creation of food, so on farms. And the biggest single thing that everybody needs to sort of understand about that is that the biggest thing we could do to reduce that is to reduce the amount of meat and dairy in our diets. It doesn't have to be to zero, but it's really clear cut. And that's also if you care about things like feeding the world and biodiversity and so on. Second most important thing is to make sure we eat everything we buy and nothing gets wasted, left on the plate, goes off in the fridge or anything like that. And then there's some other sort of details around what's sustainable, about what low carbon food looks like, but those are the two biggest things. Home energy, there's a mixture of different ways of bringing that down. There are ways that some people can bring it down and save money. So that's often simple things like habits of turning the lights off when you're not in the room and trying to seal up drafts and so on, like that. Simple home energy improvement things. Not always easy, you can only take them to a certain point, but they are at least simple, practical things that don't require a lot of planning and do save you money. At the other end of the scale, there are very expensive things that most people need a lot of help with, like really retrofitting your home, sorting out the energy system, sorting out the double or triple glazing, sorting out sophisticated insulation and all that kind of thing. And that's the kind of, most people in Preston will need support on that.
What's retrofitting your home mean?
Retrofitting your home means taking a leaky home. The UK's got a very energy inefficient housing stock, and turning it into a home that is efficient with its energy, doesn't leak out the energy through the walls and the windows and the drafts and so on, and maybe also has an energy system like solar panels on the roof and heat pumps that are a very efficient way of heating and so on, other measures like that. Pretty complex and it's pretty expensive, but it's a great way to go. Travel, as I said, people who fly a lot, that's 1 minute, okay? Travel is just fly less, pretty obvious. There are ways of doing this that save money. There are loads of opportunity for co-benefits here. Ways of, if we can get this happening, ways of saving money, keeping people healthier. The more we can get cycling and walking and so on, the better. And it's cheaper. And if we can get people out of petrol and diesel cars around the streets of Preston, it's also good for air quality, which keeps the population healthier as well. And then my final 30 seconds, I'll just talk about the non-food stuff. Can we have an economy in which people buy less stuff, buy it sustainably, buy things that are made to last, make them last, and most importantly, get them repaired when they break instead of just chucking them in the bin, and when you finish with them, sell them second-hand, and can things be shared instead of everybody owning their own one. So those are all ways of dematerializing. And just by the way, they also save money and some of them build community, and so there potentially are opportunities to make life better and fairer there as well. So around this kind of pie, I hope there are lots of ways of cutting the carbon that can also be done in a way that make life better for the people who are less well off and create a fairer society as well. So just a taste of us of that.